Hello, everyone. I'm Mehran Kamrava from the Iranian Studies Unit of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. I am also a professor of government at Georgetown University in Qatar. We are joined today by two wonderful scholars and good friends to discuss the recent protests and consequences of those protests in Iran. Joining us is Amir Mahdavi, who's a PhD scholar at the University of Connecticut, specializing in comparative politics and in specific institutional politics of authoritarian states. Amir, I have to say, is a contributor to a book that I have edited that will be published in May of 2023. And the book will be called The Sacred Republic, Power and Institutions in Iran. Also, I'm thrilled to welcome Maral Karimi, who is a PhD from University of Toronto. Maral's specialty is social justice education and social movements, the author of a book on the discourse of the Green Movement in Iran, a book that I have cited numerous times in a couple of the recent things I've written. So it's an absolute pleasure and a delight having both of you. Thank you both for agreeing to join us. I'm really grateful. And I thought we would start by kind of getting a lay of the land, Maral, if possible. And I know the protests, we know the protests in Iran were in they started back in the fall, in September. And here we are, several months after that. Where are we? Where do things stand? What's happening in Iran right now?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for this wonderful introduction. And I would like to say hello to all of your audiences. I think, as you mentioned, the movement started in September of 2009, and I had suspected at the beginning, originally, that this would be much longer and actually more prolonged and extended than the previous similar uprisings, such as one we witnessed in November of 2019, prior to that in 2018. The characteristics were kind of different than before. Right now, I feel like, the street protests have kind of tapered down over the past couple of months, although there are some here and there. However, when there's significant street presence for months and significant violence, the state violence and repression at the same time, and many were imprisoned, many went underground. This kind of going underground, I guess, is to be expected. I feel like the underground groups, the organizers, are kind of scaling back on these street protests to regroup and at the same time to reorganize. And at the same time, the state has been releasing many of those prisoners. Some of the long-term, like key prisoners, such as Dr. Farhad Maysami, such as many women that have been in custody, Alia Mutallibzadeh, so on and so forth. I hesitate naming names because I don't want to bring in some names and leave others out. But so the state has also been added recently. But overall, I would say we're in the regrouping stage. And well, then there is the opposition, mostly the opposition living abroad in the diaspora. They haven't. They have also been busy, kind of trying to fill in the so-called vacuum. And so I guess we can talk about that more later. So overall, that's where I would say we're at right now.
There appears to be a general sense of unease and a sense of anticipation of some change on the ground in Iran. Is that an accurate assessment? And what do you attribute that to?
Definitely. It's like I mentioned, this is different than the times before. This has been far more extensive in terms of the geography, in terms of the class, the composition of the movement, as well as the various groups of people, cross sections of people that were involved. But particularly, I think it's because it has been, it finally brought together the two major fault lines of the regime, namely gender and ethnicity. It has brought them together. And I mean, I would say largely it was a middle class movement, largely. I mean, we can always dispute that in certain areas of the country, but the unease is because all these people have finally come together, and finally the unspoken is being shouted on the streets. And we know this is not resolved. We know that government doesn't have the political will or the political capital to actually accommodate them. So this is not over. It's just, that's why I call it regrouping. And both the government is sensitive to that, and also the protesters are gauging their next steps.
Thank you. That's great. I want to come back to, you mentioned the opposition. We'll come back to that. But Amir, what are some of the consequences of what's been happening in Iran over the last several months? What are some of the changes that are happening, if they are indeed happening, and how is the state responding, either intentionally or unintentionally?
Great, thank you. Thank you for having me again. Actually, I think it would be better if we have a very short, brief sense of the main causes that made this series of unrest actually unprecedented, both in terms of the geographic spread of the movement and the protest, and the duration as well. We experienced that from, I think, early September until late January, every February, in the grassroots and street politics sense. Therefore, I would like to deal with the dynamics that have made contentious politics as an inevitable choice for people and triggered the most significant protests after the 1979 revolution in Iran. So I would like to highlight three main gridlocks in governance that are the cause and are the roots of, could be introduced as a cause and roots of this a recent wave of unrest, and maybe everything that government tries to do should be in one of these three areas that I would categorize as institutional, foreign policy, and ruling political elite composition as underlying contributor factors to the recent issues. They are actually reflected in the official surveys, which indicate that Iranians are convinced that the future will only be worse in terms of these three indicators, and there is no hope for an improvement in governance in near future. So we see a sort of dialectic of subjects and real-world governance gridlocks that represents two records in the recent 4 decades. The worst situation as indicated in the indexes, official indexes, and the least hope for improvements. We had periods in the past that actual state of public affairs were intimidating. However, there was a light at the end of the tunnel and hope for change in place, like destruction caused by the 8-year Iran-Iraq war and the great hope for reconstruction in 90s. or the pressure of the Security Council imposed nuclear sanction and the hope created by the election of Rouhani in 2012-2013. This time, not only are multi-fronts of governance experiencing major decline, but people also see no sign of a chance of improvements. This is reflected in, as I said, in official public opinion polls and surveys that 70%, more than 70% of people are dissatisfied by the current situation, and they believe that the situation will be worsening near future. So I would be delighted to elaborate or give a brief explanation in all three categories, maybe in respond to your next questions or in Q&A part.
Yeah, thank you. You know, what you just said is reflected in the recent announcement that former President Khatami said. He said he basically said that former reformist strategies, or the strategies that the reformists formerly used, no longer have any response or bear the desired results, and he advocated changing tactics, and it was actually a very detailed prescription of institutional changes that he said. This came shortly after a similar declaration by Mir Hossein Mahdavi, former prime minister and presidential candidate who's been under house arrest. And Mahdavi said that we just need a new referendum. We need to have a referendum, and we need to draft a new constitution. So what do all of these mean? What's the status of the internal forces in Iran and their audiences in Iran? Amir.
Well, thank you for raising these two important declaration or public letters that issued by former prime minister and former president. Yes, what is resonated in both of those very important and I can say historical texts is, again, the reflection of these gridlocks, the sort of confession that the traditional way of seeking reform within the structure is halted right now, and we cannot continue the same tactics and strategy that we used to employ since 25 years ago, since the first years of what we called as like reform era in 1997. I can see the like some sort of relation between those texts and the three categories that I just laid out. I think a gridlock in foreign policy is at the level that we cannot talk about any domestic solution and resolution for, let's say, reconciliation among the factions, or having even a free election, or do any kind of reform without addressing that very, very important issue, which is under jurisdiction of the supreme leader and wouldn't change with elections or the interaction between political elites and political factions. Another one that I wanted to highlight is the grand plan that was implemented by supreme leaders since 5 years ago, called the second phase or second step of revolution, that followed by the major, I can say, refine and purification of administration. So I think it doesn't matter if the composition of the parliament would change, or even the ministers themselves through a relatively competitive election. The new texture of the state that we have after the declaration of the second phase of revolution, I think it would be very, very hard to think that they would cooperate with the results of any kind of free election. And And the other one, obviously, is the gridlock in the election and the cycle of power, which is the unprecedented situation we saw in the last parliamentary and presidential election that made the elections more like hegemonic authoritarian elections that we see in Syria right now, or in Iraq during the Ba'ath Party ruling, not as a electoral authoritarian states in which we see some sort of real competition within the loyal factions to the regime.
Thank you. Amir, I want to come back to Khamenei's endgame, what he has in mind. But before I do, I want to turn to Maral. And Maral, you mentioned the opposition. We just talked about these two opposition leaders in Iran. And just recently, at my home institution at Georgetown University the other day, we had these 8 figures get together, 8 individuals. What do you make of that? Is there a coalition, an oppositional coalition being formed? The opposition outside has been notoriously fragmented. Is this something to be taken seriously, or is this the same old laughable opposition that we've been accustomed to for the last 43 years, that's been saying 2 months from now the Islamic Republic is going to collapse? Sorry, you're muted.
I think figures is the operative word here. Yes, there are 8 figures, but what kind of figures are we talking about here? Are they, active, politically inclined and politically savvy figures? Are they savvy political activists? I would say maybe a few are, but mostly they were selected or elected to be selected there to sit there for their name recognition, and some of them for their celebrity status, which anyone in the political world or in the socio-political world would agree that is not the way to go about putting together political leaders and for such a complex situation as it is in Iran. And I would say that, that kind of hodgepodge of figures were mostly representative of the right. And the reason they get to have a louder voice, and the reason an Ivy League university such as Georgetown would host them and the media would cover it, is because historically the right, no matter where, usually has a louder voice. Think about it. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, obviously, but there's a significant voice on the ground in Iran that was telling us that these young people, these protesters on the street, want a similar democracy, a similar type of government as kind of what we have in the free democratic world, so to speak. And so if they are to achieve that, for a second there, let's say they achieve that, then the West has to deal with them as an equal. They're no longer they're no longer as a kind of a member of the global South. They would be negotiating for in terms of economic treaties and so on and so forth in international relations. They would be negotiating on equal footing. And obviously that's not in their benefit. A Middle East that is more dependent, a Middle East that is kind of a just as a tunnel for the world powers to go through, and kind of pillage is preferred, and that's the basics of power relations. So naturally, the right have a higher voice because that they have a bigger voice because, for example, women who would put together, who would marry politics and women's rights, who want deep structural changes, not only in Iran, but in the neighboring countries, are obviously not elevated to that level on the world stage. Or when it comes to the rights of the ethnics, the most watered down version of it was kind of represented, in my opinion, in that panel. So that panel was very significant in that it was telling us where some, and I kind of reiterate on some of the world political will is going, what their preference is, and what kind of representatives for women of Iran they would prefer. And then it was also telling us that this is largely a right kind of hodgepodge of groups, and the rest of the more democratic and the left need to also get their acts together and kind of get the discourse going. And I would also add this. It's not that the rest of the opposition is, without criticism. Obviously, we all know that. But certain voices, certain narratives, and certain political views have always had they gained a platform, and they always had a louder voice. But it does not mean that they're representative of majority of voices on the ground. Women, life, freedom, I think it speaks for itself. And that's not in any shape or form kind of representative of the kind of politics or future form of government that is based on hereditary form of governance, monarchy, or any such thing as that.
Thank you, Amir. I want to continue that line that Maral just pointed to, and ask you: is a domestic discourse of opposition forming in Iran? We had what by now must be forgotten, but Mustafa Tajzadeh's very elaborate and very detailed 8 points shortly before he was arrested. He talked about exactly how to go about implementing reforms. And now we have had Mousavi and Khatami, figures that have been discredited in Iran for a variety of reasons, but at least they're in touch. Not like someone who hasn't been to Iran for more than 4 decades, for example, who would be part of this panel in Washington, D.C., or someone who's completely out of touch with the reality of the ground and what the Iranian youth would want or would hope for, as Maral just mentioned. Is there indeed a domestic discourse of opposition forming, or is that wishful thinking, or am I reading too much into it?
Great, thank you. Yes, you are right. It's a very some sort of tension or challenging these discourses inside and outside the country. Actually, I have 2 points in this regard. First of all, the call for the structural reform that was the common theme in Tajzadeh, Mousavi, and Khatami's plan. Was, I think, a new thing, a new platform that was presented to people as we can say some sort of plan for transition or a platform for change. We haven't seen such a clear cut platform, even though it it was called wishful thinking by some conservative inside the country, or some factions of reformists who still believe in like electoral politics as they practiced in the past 2 decades. But I think at least they are proposing something, and we know about. But what we are hearing from the Georgetown event and the all of the these unified voices of opposition we are recently hear about, is that we have to be united to overthrow the regime, and we don't propose and we don't suggest any kind of even platform or path for this kind of transition. We are just unify our voices for the regime change, and we want to be represented as a unified opposition in contact with Western leaders. So this is the underlying points and maybe the underlying difference between these two kind of proposals. They are unified because they want to say to the Western leaders that we are representing the whole diaspora and the whole the opposition parts of the diaspora. And the other point that I want to briefly mention is that I think this the unity and cooperation in grassroots level, I mean the street politics within the cities of Iran, and what we see from the Iranian people outside the country, or the people who are inside the country but don't hesitate to participate in protest, is a very unified notion under the slogan of women life freedom. But at the same time, I think we have it's hard to understand how the disengagement and how the different platforms of the opposition in political level inside and outside the country can resonate each other, can work with each other, and can actually make some sort of synergy. I can say that I wonder how the opposition, the opposition outside the country, how they feel that they don't need to cooperate with inside opposition. I don't say that they propose a mutual platform with Mousavi or Khatami necessarily, but we don't see any try in the opposition and especially the group that are coming together recently to try to represent, let's say, famous prisoners in Iran and the people who are paying a lot of cost during these protests. So I see this kind of disengagement between the two groups, and I think the future month and maybe future years would be a good example to see which of these two groups would be more capable in mobilizing people inside Iran. We don't have any proof from either yet.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. There's a bunch of questions that are coming in through social media, and I want to get to them, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask this question. I have to admit, motivated partly out of self-interest. In one way or another, all of us are students of revolutions, and all three of us at least, and many of our audience members are familiar with revolutions. Are we witnessing, if you could, both of you quickly answer this question very briefly, are we witnessing the beginning of a revolution within the revolution, or a new revolution in Iran, or is this some sort of political phenomenon which is as yet undefined? Maral?
Well, actually, thank you so much for asking that. I've been, saying this since the beginning of this movement that it started. I don't think we can call it a revolution by definition yet, simply because, revolutions can only be termed when they come to fruition. And I also disagree with calling it a feminist revolution. It has certain characteristics that are not met in this term. The fact that women and minoritized ethnics take center stage and women's rights and the structural changes that we need are, central to this movement, are definitely. I mean, we can't dispute that, but to call it a feminist revolution or a revolution at all, I think that's a stretch. Why do I insist on not calling it a revolution? Because first of all, I study discourse, and words and speech are very important to me. And when we call it a revolution already, we kind of, I feel like we cut some of its potential at the root. And I'm very glad that it's taking so long, that it's becoming so extensive instead of kind of erupting and then coming to some sort of result. I've been always saying that the longer this takes, the more time we're going to have to hear each other out, hopefully to have a discourse on this and to kind of hopefully guide it, whatever it is, towards a more democratic Iran.
Perfect. Thank you. Amir, quickly.
I completely agree. I completely agree that it's actually maybe it was harmful that people started to calling these events and the notion as revolution since early September, especially in the Persian TVs based in United Kingdom and in the US. I think they thought that by repeating the term of the revolution, they are contributing to making a revolution happen, and by calling that it would become a revolution. But today, when we see almost, at least today, we see almost no sign of protest and unrest throughout the country, and the control of Islamic Republic on the whole land in any definition. The state is in place, and we have a state ruling the country. It would be worth researching and thinking about the impact of those terminology and using those kind of terminology for this movement in recent 4 months, and to see if they contributed to the purpose of this movement, or maybe jeopardized it in some level.
Perfect. Thank you. Let me quickly go to some of the questions we've been getting. Here's a question, and forgive me for reading it, but it's a bit long. It says, don't Iranian Kurds mostly want a more protected, decentralized federal state within some version of the current regime-led state? Likewise, don't Iranian, mostly men workers, often organized in trade unions, who are organized in trade unions, often want some form of legal guarantees of better working conditions and pay? Isn't it domestically unacceptable? For so-called minorities to embrace the call, mostly led by ethnic Persians, including many middle-class women, to demand regime change, whatever that's supposed to mean? Maral?
I mean, that's a tall order. I'm not Kurdish. I think a Kurdish scholar would be best suited to answer this for, transitionality's sake. But I have done extensive research on the issue of minoritized ethnics, and I call them minoritized ethnics because at 49% of the population, they certainly are not a minority. But they have been subalternized over the past about 100 years via formation of the Iranian nation state in mid-20th century, early 20th century. I'm not sure exactly whether that was a question or a statement, but yes, trade unions in Iran In name, they are kind of they have some leeway, but largely what we have been seeing over the past few years, trade unionization in Iran is feared just as it is in the world of capitalism, and it has been certainly repressed harshly over the years. And as for what the Kurds want and what other minoritized ethnics want, just like any other population in the world and in Iran, their demands and wants and needs are varied. But I think our opposition is better served by a multiplicity of voices from different factions as opposed to a few voices that agree with each other, whether it is in the opposition in the diaspora or whether it is inside domestically from the reformists and some such.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone, either of you know the answer to this question. I certainly don't. But a question has come in saying, I'm wondering if anyone can give a status update on Avay Divanagan Theater Group and founder Saman Arastu. Do either of you know? No. It would be worth looking up and seeing what's happening. But here's another question. What are your thoughts on the march that just took place, celebrating the 44th anniversary of the revolution? What does this tell us about state popularity or the state's ability to mobilize its supporters into choreographed demonstrations of political support?
Do you want me to?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Actually, as we discussed earlier, I think that was an indicator of the regime's capability to preserve its capacity for mobilization and the capacity to the capacity of mobilization. At least it's the loyal part of the population. I don't know how many we can call exactly, 15%, 20%, whatever. So what people expected since the early days of this movement was some sort of shrinking within the structure of the regime, within the core of the state. I think that didn't happen, and if we had more time to discuss, I would attribute that somehow to that grand plan of the second phase of the revolution. This set of power, set of political elites that we have in power right now have been already purified. And so I think they are representing a very small minority of the country. I think the people who are really loyal to the regime, if the number was maybe more than 70% in 80s, today should be less than 25 or less than 20%. But that 20% is a very strong, cohesive core of the society that have very strong ties and relationship with the regime in terms of their social status, their financial affairs, and so on. So I don't see any kind of shrinking or any kind of decline in the mobilization power of the regime, but at the same time we don't see any successful attempt for covering more segments of society, and that's 3/4 of dissatisfied people.
Okay, thank you. If moving on, if I could ask you to keep your responses short. And one of our good friends, Professor Nader Habibi, has a question for both of you, and one for Maral and one for Amir. So Maral, let me ask the question that Professor Habibi asks for you. He says, we've witnessed the rise of, a rise of anti-religious sentiments and very strong criticism of Islam by some protesters in social media. Can you please comment on the significance of this development? Are the protesters non-religious, or are we witnessing the emergence of a collective anti-Shia or anti-religious sentiment as a lasting cultural change?
Well, like I mentioned before, Iran is a vast country. It's multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual. And so it depends on which cross-section of the society we're talking about. I think it's not something that just happened through this movement, most recent movement, but since the beginning of the Islamic Republic. I think the religious sentiments, the religious attachments of a large cross-section of people, especially the middle and the upper classes, have been kind of on a decline. And one of the reasons, and this is just one of the many reasons, is obviously Islamic Republic's interference with religion as a private matter and interfering into people's private spheres, not keeping religion, a private matter. But recently, we've also been on the streets. The sentiments, the slogans, and the discourse that I've been hearing is largely, it's actually quite enlightening. It's quite democratic. It targets a theocracy. It targets political Islam. It targets the kind of religion, any religion, that interferes in people's private spheres. Those burnings of headscarves and so on. I understand that they've kind of been interpreted as Islamophobia, but I actually think these young men and women on the street were quite intuitively quite careful to kind of not humiliate or not address people's genuine religious affiliations, which is a democratic right. It's a human right, but it is largely targeted that anger is targeted towards the elite, the government. But I do think it's a lasting cultural change in terms of religion, not because of the recent movement, but because of the way the Islamic Republic has been treating religion.
I thank you. Just if I may add my own note, I haven't been to Iran since the protests started, but anecdotally and based on the news that is coming out, one of the developments that we may not necessarily be aware of outside is also among certain social strata, a polarization of cultural values, because there are indeed some people, whether or not they're tied in one form or another to the state, that do believe in mandatory hijab, mandatory headscarf. And we have seen in some cases an altercation between people who kind of on their own, particularly women who've been accosting or insulting women who are not properly observing the hijab. So I have no idea how extensive that is. I think it's difficult to kind of get an accurate sense of that, but I do think, and it may not be pervasive at all, but I do think it's important to kind of keep that in mind also. Amir, Dr. Habibi has a question for you, and he says, in the past couple of weeks, the government has released a large number of political prisoners, and these are mostly people who had been arrested during the protests. What's the main motivation, and has the sudden unexpected release of prisoners reduced the costs of protests? Ask like a true economist.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Nader Habibi, Brandeis economist and a good friend. Actually, I want to mention three possible consequences of that of course, this kind of major release of the imprisoned people, I have to highlight that that was a really larger move than everybody expected. So I learned news. I learned from the Tehran prison and prison in Tabriz last day that, let's say, among the like 400 people who were arrested in the same place, less than 20 of them are remained after this move, the recent letter of the supreme leader. So that was big, that was significant, and that could both reduce the cost of maybe future protests, but at the same time that could decrease the level of animosity and the level of grievance in society as well. So maybe that would be the cause of this decision. I think the intention, the regime intention behind that could be laid out in three categories. First of all, I think that would alleviate somehow the mood of revolution situation, borrowing from Charles Tilly. So I think that would maybe alleviate the mood and atmosphere in some ways and calm down things by bringing let people to be released and bring them back to their families. At the same time, that would be a window dressing decision, especially in light of the nuclear negotiation with the West. And at the end, maybe the intention was that reducing the chance of opposition outside the country to recruit from the ordinary people.
Perfect. Thank you.
Could I just mention?
Absolutely. Yes.
I agree with everything you just mentioned. However, I have a feeling that because some of these prisoners that were released are still on very heavy bails, so that also raises. I mean, on the one hand, yes, the government doesn't have to look after them; they don't have to pay the high cost of repressing these political prisoners. But at the same time, releasing them, many of them are not going to be inclined to participate heavily. I mean, some of them might still do that, but if you have a heavy bail, especially if somebody else posted that bail for you, you're less inclined to kind of participate and be active.
Very good point. Thank you so much for adding that that note. What's the impact of external pressures on this movement in Iran, especially the role of states like the US, Israel, and European countries? Maral?
Would you like to address that? That seems more like up your alley, but.
Actually,
this is part of Iranian style.
Yes.
Either one of you, go ahead.
I think we talked about it a little bit, but I mean, yes, there's definitely an impact of the pressure of the not only the Europeans, and the North American powers, but also the powers in the Middle East. The other countries in the Middle East. Now, public international relations is not my forte, but from what we see and what I kind of mentioned briefly, the so-called democratic world definitely would not want to be negotiating with Iran or any other Middle Eastern power on equal footing, simply because of our geopolitical situation, because of all the resources and because of all the tensions in the region. So yes, there are impacts, and as you can see, certain voices are elevated, certain voices are invited to, let's say, conferences like, if it's even a conference, Davos, and places like that, and there's some sort of a regrouping also happening in the West. There are certain political groups that obviously see it in their best interest to support the rightist kind of diaspora, and we hear all about support for democracy in Iran and all that, and women's rights. But from where I'm standing, not all, but many of these voices don't necessarily want fundamental structural changes in Iran when it comes to democracy, when it comes to the rights of women. It's not their priority. The priority is not democracy in the Middle East. So I don't know if that answers your question.
And for where I'm standing, Maral, it seems like many of the interested parties would much rather have a weak Iran rather than a democratic Iran, a state that under the Islamic Republic or any other republic or any other form of political configuration is fundamentally weak rather than democratic. There's a couple of questions in terms of, we've addressed this. Let me just ask: is the diaspora-inland divide or the internal-external divide still relevant today? Have global digital spaces and very recent waves of refugees not blurred these lines? Amir?
Actually, as I try to make this kind of argument earlier, I think the significant role of the social media that makes the people on grassroots level very interconnected and very unified in terms of the slogans, in terms of the themes, in terms of the even pictures, posters, color they use that we have been seeing in this movements, but we have a great deal of divergence in political level and the political leader level. Especially, I want to highlight the role of the foreign governments and the Persian media outside the country. So actually those Persian media are being sponsored by foreign governments as well. But the focus and the orientation of the Western leaders, the Western political parties, and the media, I think, contributed to this kind of divergence, and we see two paths and two kind of political platforms that are pursuing by inside and outside opposition.
And it does seem to me, I mean, going back to this question, it does seem to me that there's a fundamental disconnect between situation on the ground in Iran and that reality as reflected in the media outside of Iran, whether it is the Iranian exile or diaspora media, or if it's CNN or some other Western media outlet. And it seems that the reality is far more complex and far more textured, if you will, than this image that we have of the country about to either erupt or collapse or have some sort of fundamental change. Maral, I see you nodding. I gather you agree?
Absolutely. I think, as you know, as we were just talking about it, the disconnect is vast. I feel like, particularly, well, the right is, and I specifically talk about the right not because the other groups don't kind of engage in similar tactics, but because the right has mobilized and it's more significant at the moment, at least the past few weeks. The right is trying to co-opt a movement that is, I mean, the main slogan is women, life, freedom. It's very clear about what it wants. It's time and again, and I'm basing this on my observations. Obviously, I haven't been in Iran in a long time, and I'm just reading what's coming in and analyzing the discourse. But most importantly, what's getting lost in translation, what's getting lost accidentally on purpose, is the fact that this movement is insisting that it's not leader-centric. It's not so like the 79. It's not like even the Green movement. It's not like the oil nationalization movement that was kind of centered around one male masculine leader. To me, it's more similar to the constitutional revolution in a sense. But the thing is, the right is trying to kind of prop up one single leader, as opposed to domestically, the protesters are shouting. Their slogans are collective. Their demands are more collective. They're more feminist. They're more, even though I reiterate that it's not a feminist revolution, but it's very ethnic and women centric, which is something that is getting lost both by the right and by the rest. I mean, we cannot have another group of men from the center writing the next, the rules of the next government, the laws for the laws of the land. It needs to be more inclusive, and it specifically needs to have more women, more minoritized ethnics, more marginalized people of all, classes included. And that's something that the Persian-speaking media in the West are kind of trying to make obscure.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'm only going to ask one last question, but I just, in the interest of fairness, there's this comment that has come in. It's not a question, it's a comment. I'll read it. It deserves a whole discussion of its own, but I'm not sure who it's from, but it says, I'm not comfortable with using the labels right and left, where right means regressive and left means progressive. This is sheer political bias, according to me. I don't think we find that, I don't think any of us have any argument with that, but I just had to read that. Last question, excellent analyses by the guest scholars. You notice how pointedly I was excluded from that. Excellent analysis by the guest scholars, but that's okay. But what is a synthesis of the situation? In other words, now what? What is the best way to proceed to continue the movement toward the establishment of democracy in Iran? And I'll give you both the last word. Why don't we start with you, Amir?
Actually, maybe it's not the best comment for the end of the session, but I'm not so optimistic about the democratic future achievements of this movement. Very briefly, I think the chance of both some sort of reformation in terms of state structure, in terms of states orientation, in foreign policy, in economy, in domestic politics, and even the whole structure of the states, and there's some sort of unsustained path to state failure. Both of those scenarios are more likely than achieving a democratic transition in near future. So maybe that would be the best hope of some of the participants and the contributors to this movement, but for many reasons which we don't have time to describe here, to explain here, I see those two possible outcomes more likely than a democratic transition.
Perfect, thank you. And Maral?
I mean, this is, like you said, it's a whole discussion on its own, but I think we have to understand that these structures, these oppressive structures that people are rising up against, it didn't start in 79. Many of them have historically, at least in the history of modern Iran, have existed. And in my own research, I kind of traced those structures and their continuation through the Pahlavis and through the Islamic Republic. So we have to understand that, because there is a very significant movement trying to kind of overhaul and kind of come up with a revisionist history, as if all of this has happened started in 79. This is a much bigger problem that we're facing right now, and we need more discussions, I think, like this. We need more discourse. We need to include more voices, and we need, because I only have very few seconds remaining, we need to demand more of our media. Why do I insist on that? not just because that's where my heart lies, but because the media, in the absence of free media, particularly within Iran, these Farsi-speaking media in the West are shaping public opinion. Of course, they can't shape everybody's opinion, but they have significant impact. So we need to demand more of them, and we need to kind of critically engage with our own beliefs and biases and demand more discourse.
Perfect. Thank you. Now, folks, you heard it here. I think that was a green light to me to invite you again here. I hope you'll indulge me again in a few months as we continue to study Iran and see what's happening. I cannot thank you both enough. This has been such a wonderful conversation, and I'm really sorry our time has come to an end. I could go on forever and ever, and I'm really grateful that both of you, at this early hour of morning in your respective time zones, took time to take part in this event. You have my sincere gratitude, and I'm really grateful to all of you. Thank you very much to you, Amir Mahdavi and Maral Karimi. You both have my sincere thanks, and my sincere thanks also to our audiences around the world. I sincerely do apologize if I didn't get to go through all of your questions. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I hope you join us for our next conversation. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.